Hello and welcome back to Well Woman Podcast. This episode is all about histamine. One of the emerging conditions that I see in women during midlife, particularly, is histamine intolerance or some expression of reactivity to foods which contain histamine or even, chemistry, chemicals that contain histamine. And it actually creeps into all aspects of our lives if we have this. So if you resonate with symptoms like headaches, runny nose, shortness of breath, it's not necessarily a food intolerance, and it's not necessarily sleep deprivation. The most likely thing is that you could be doing your best and eating more healthy overall, but you're just really finding these random symptoms to be very discouraging. Also, sometimes these histamine symptoms can mean that we end up reducing our food diversity, which can be an issue for our microbiome. And unfortunately, we just end up getting more and more sensitive to a wide variety of foods. So it could be that there's too much of certain foods that are rich in histamine in your diet. There are some other symptoms also to be on the lookout for. So if you've got itchy skin, if you've ever had an itchy scalp, come on immediately after eating something like chocolate or some sort of food, that's a really good indicator. And I can relate to that. I remember my older brother and I talking about this as we were in our teens, that for some reason we eat chocolate and we get an itchy scalp. Some of the other things I would be on the lookout for are rashes or hives, particularly if they keep coming up and they're a little bit persisting, and you haven't necessarily done anything other than just eat the foods that might have caused it. So often, it's going to be dairy or sugar, things like that. So some of the other things, low blood pressure could be another sign. A very common one is nausea. Nausea after eating certain foods. In some people, it might lead to vomiting, not always. That's more of an extreme case. Diarrhea could be another one, or just loose bowel motions. Swelling of the throat, lips, or tongue. They, again, seem like allergy symptoms, but never underestimate the impact of histamine. So in this episode of Well Woman, I thought it might just be good to give you a primer in histamine because it's not all bad. And so this is Histamine 101. Get ready to learn all about this sometimes useful, but sometimes mischievous and completely natural chemical that we all eat, we all drink, we all manufacture internally. I wanted to take this opportunity to explain what happens in the run-up period towards developing histamine intolerance and shed some light on the reasons why we you and I might have ended up with an accumulation of histamine in the first place. And also, of course, this means that I'm going to be talking about some of the nutrients and herbs that I use in clinic in these situations to be able to calm down that histamine response. So I hope that you enjoy this episode. I hope it gives you more insights, more data to inform your journey into the happiest and healthiest version of you. Hello and welcome to Well Woman. It's Sulin, your hormone health coach, and thank you for tuning in. If you're looking for the latest advice on women's health, food, mood, tips, hacks, and all the hormone things, you've come to the right place. I hope you love this episode. Let's get to the show. Let's first talk about what histamine is. It was actually one of the very earliest neurotransmitters to be identified. And it was seen as more of an allergy reaction chemical. So this was in the early 20th century. And then around 100 years later in the 21st century, we identified this phenomenon of histamine intolerance, which I'll talk more about in a minute. And since then, we've learned more about histamine. We've come to understand that this is a neurochemical that actually plays an incredibly important role in our autoimmune disease processes, in our gut function, even in the way that we handle daily stresses. So it plays a role in our nervous system function as well. For example, when I get together with clients and I do my initial screening, we look at these chemicals called neurochemicals, for example, dopamine, serotonin, acetylcholine, which are all involved in different aspects of our cognitive and neurological function, and also mood as well, gut function, cravings, behaviors. And one of the ones that I'm particularly interested in is what's happening with the histamine. Histamine issues, including deficiency of histamine, can be one of the causes behind this chronic underlying sense of unease. And as you can imagine, that then is a bit of a pathway to anxiety disorders, chronic stress, and poor stress tolerance as well. So this feeling of unease, something just isn't quite right, but you can't totally describe it as chronic stress. It just creates this feeling of dis-ease, disharmony in the body, this general uneasiness. Your body naturally makes histamine, so it's not histamine issues are not just about the histamine that we're taking in through our food and our drink. It's also about the histamine that we're making internally. Truth is, you might be making too much of it, or you might not be able to remove it efficiently, or you may have issues with having enough there. And, it almost sounds a bit like a hormone, right? So we're delicately trying to balance the amount of histamine that we have in our bodies. Having too much isn't great because then we go into all of those symptoms that I mentioned before, the rashes, the food intolerances, the reactivity, the inflammation. And then sometimes we don't have enough, which leads us into more of a deficiency state. So then we're getting into not having a robust enough stress response every day. And it's a little bit of an emerging science, this concept of our neurotransmitters and so on. I don't feel like we've had many hundreds of years to be able to research it. So yes, let me just, little Microsoft Teams notifications. Let me just close that down. So we're still waiting. So we're still waiting for some of the evidence to emerge. I also don't want to alarm you because histamine is natural. It's one of those things, just like hormones, where we can have too much of it or we might not have enough of it. So what we want to just do is get balance, get as close to balance as we can, because with all hormones, it's often really hard to get perfect balance, but we just try to get good balance. So it's pretty unlikely that any of us have a serious histamine excess, but histamine is involved in one of the responses to allergens, and that response is a mast cell-driven response. So it's likely that we have overactive histamine. It's also not likely that we have a complete allergy to histamine, but we have more of an intolerance. We have not been able to process it adequately to get the right sort of balance level. So we're starting to develop an intolerance to it. And that's probably more the focus of this podcast episode, because it's the more realistic, scenario for most of you. Most of you will be able to eat a certain amount of histamine and feel okay, but then once you start eating too much or ingesting too much of histamine in your diet, then you start to get some issues emerging. So we're not going into the serious issues with complete allergy to histamine. We're more talking about, what are the situations where we're going to develop some sort of intolerance to it? How do we manage that? How do we mitigate the effects of that? And histamine is natural, so it's present in all of our body tissues. The highest concentration is found in these mast cells. You might have heard of these because they're involved in a lot of allergy reactions. If you were following the news during the COVID pandemic, you would have heard about mast cell reactivity coming up and flaring up a lot of inflammation in response to COVID. You might have heard of mast cell activity in relation to just general allergies as well. There are also really high levels of histamine in our lungs and high levels of histamine in our basophils, which are a type of white blood cell which is found in our bone marrow. And remember, the white blood cells, these are the ones that are involved in immune function, just as our mast cells are. So when you think about getting your blood test results back and they've given you your red blood cell count and red cell distribution width and those sorts of things, then you've also got your neutrophils, your basophils, eosinophils. These are the white blood cells. So basophils play a protective role for us. They fight against pathogens, they fight parasites, and of course, they fight allergens. So their reason for being, their raison d'etre, is actually to fight. They're very reactive. One of the particular actions that histamine has in our body is to go into this reactivity. So it dilates our blood vessels. It's a vasoactive agent. It also affects our smooth muscle tissues, has also a very strong effect on our itch nerves. But where we know the most about it leads to infection. That's why most of us, when we talk about histamine, we immediately think about allergies and an overactive, immune system where, we get this trauma to the body, we get exposed to an allergen, and then histamine launches into this very reactive response. It's acting on the smooth muscles now, it's making them contract, it's acting on the blood vessels, and it's dilating them. And this is really all part of that natural protective response to invading pathogens or to allergens. And one thing that histamine shares in common with a lot of hormones is that in order to really activate and cause some effect in your body, it needs to bind to something called a receptor. So hormones do this to enact on our bodies and cause different types of physiological responses. Histamine does this as well. There are about 4 different types of histamine receptors that are well explained and understood. So in this, Histamine 101 crash course, let me share with you about these 4 different types of receptors. The first one is called H1. It's found in your nerve cells and in your airways and in your blood vessels. When this receptor becomes activated by histamine, it starts to cause some of those allergy symptoms that you might already be familiar with. So you might get some itching, for example. You might get some flushing of the skin. You might get some tightness in the chest. So this is basically bronchial constriction that's occurring, bronchoconstriction. And you might get some shortness of breath as well. So these are the H1 receptors that are sort of causing those initial allergy-style responses. They also play a role in your sleep-wake cycle. So you might find that your sleep gets more disturbed to some degree. And actually, histamine can make us a bit wakeful. This is why sometimes antihistamines cause drowsiness, because histamine makes you a little bit more alert. So remember again, the quality of histamine is reactive, protective. It's trying to protect us against invasion. So of course, it's going to make our bodies sit up and take note, and perhaps we become more alert in that response. And the antihistamines, by the way, they do make you more drowsy because they're blocking the histamine, and they're stopping one of the other things that these responses are involved with, which is asthma. So if you have a lot of activity with histamine and the H1 receptors, then you can also get some of that smooth muscle spasm inflammation and lots of mucus that are associated with asthma. So the second type, let's have a look at the H2 receptors. These are very much based in the digestive system and the heart, also to a degree in the smooth muscle tissues. So what you get here with H2 activation is a drop in blood pressure, sometimes headaches, sometimes flushing. You might even get tachycardia. So it can feel like your heart is beating quite fast. So there have been, in my experience in clinic over the years, several women who've had these sorts of symptoms, particularly headaches, so eating certain foods and then developing headaches straight afterwards. They're starting to become more prevalent, those sorts of symptoms. Cheeks starting to become more flushed, so pink rosy cheeks, getting more red, sometimes rash. Think about this also as one of the prevailing symptoms of perimenopause, where we start to get this heat building in the body, and then menopause, so flushing of the face. Eczema and dermatitis could also be in here, and dry scalp. And I find that with these women who present, particularly in midlife, with this redness, this dryness, this inflammation, I put them on a low histamine diet, and those symptoms start to reduce pretty quickly. So it's much easier to look at how can I reduce the levels of histamine in my diet, and then I don't get the symptoms at all, or I don't get them as frequently. It's a much better way to approach this than to start thinking about, should I be on an antihistamine? Because antihistamines in the longer term, they're going to play all sorts of games with your hydrochloric acid and stomach production, etc. So there's also the H3 and the H4 receptors. This is the third and fourth type. The H3 receptors are mainly based in the central nervous system. So this is where we enter in the domain of how we're feeling, how we're behaving. It's about your stress tolerance, your motivation, your feelings of well-being. And having too much of histamine doesn't always mean that you're going to have allergy symptoms. You might just actually be feeling psychologically flat, unmotivated, unwell. You might not be sleeping as well. So you may not notice the flushing of the skin or the itchy skin or some of those other symptoms at all. The H4 receptors for histamine, they're found in your bone marrow mainly. They play a role in inflammation and autoimmune disease. So I'll stop here on the receptors because we don't need to know an incredible amount of detail of all of these, but it might come up useful in the future if you're ever wanting to work on specific histamine symptoms and you're wondering, so which receptors then are my symptoms relating to? You might want to be working out why your histamine symptoms might be different to somebody else. It's still a histamine issue, but you just happen to have this expression of it. And this is just one foundational truth in complementary medicine and any holistic system of medicine. We are all different. We all have our different constitutional types. We have different personalities. We have different genetics. And it might even be helpful for you to explore this. What is my dosha type in Ayurveda? What is my humoral type in Western herbalism? What is my type in Chinese herbalism? All different ways of looking at this. So next up, I'd love to talk about some of the symptoms that are associated with high histamine or high histamine activity. So excess histamine can cause a variety of different symptoms, as you probably already know, because we're all different. One of the areas where it seems to, I guess people might resonate more clearly with it, is when they start to mimic allergy reactions. The most common symptoms are rashes, like hives, for example, but it could also just be a standard rash. It could be a rash resembling eczema rash as well. Itching, flushing. Irritable bowel syndrome is also one of them, because remember, we have some of these receptors in the digestive system. Indigestion, breathlessness, palpitations, migraines, dizziness, anxiety, even joint aches, nasal congestion, and lots of mucus production. Over time, in these situations, histamine would have been building up. So probably you would have noticed that the symptoms started to worsen over time. And then they get to a point where you start to develop histamine intolerance. This is where the histamine has been building up in your body. You've started to develop a sensitivity to it, and you're starting to get symptoms from your body saying, I don't like this, there's too much of this. Throw it back up if you've got nausea, get rid of it if you've got pain, headaches, etc. It's just throwing you into imbalance. And while histamine is a chemical that our bodies naturally make and that we're ingesting in our food, sometimes like of a normal amount, if our body can't break it down the way that it's supposed to, it is going to build up. It's just like any other chemical in the body. And then you're going to get some of these upset stomach symptoms, headaches, or allergy symptoms. Histamine intolerance is defined as a disequilibrium of accumulated histamine and the capacity for breaking that histamine down. So this clinical term addresses, this pathway where histamine it's getting ingested, but the response is not as robust as it could be. It's not getting broken down well enough. It's not necessarily an immune response issue. It's more that we've just got too much building up, too many residues of the histamine. And some people are unable to actually degrade, break down their ingested histamine properly, which then leads into sensitivity to normal, even low levels of histamine in food. And the problem, if you don't address this, is you start to eat less of those foods. Over time, it gets more foods that are problematic, and you start reducing your diet even more. And we need diversity in our diets, for our microbiome health. The research on this topic has been accelerating dramatically in the last decade. So we've got more and more awareness now of histamine intolerance, more interest from the general public, and more to think about if you've got allergy symptoms. However, to date, there is no review on histamine intolerance in children, and I think that's really important because maybe we're just thinking it's eczema, maybe we're thinking it's allergies. We've got to think about histamine for everyone, not just adults. So it's a highly relevant issue now, becoming more so in pediatrics with some studies, but not enough yet. So if you do have children and they've got some of these issues coming up, headaches, rashes, eczema, think about histamine and just maybe even think about a low histamine diet for a period of time. So how do we get to the point where we get to a buildup of histamine? It happens in one of two ways. So number one, you're either taking too much in, you're either eating too many foods that are high in histamine, or drinks, and even medicines, even some herbal medicines are high in histamines. And the second pathway is your body isn't breaking it down effectively. So that leads to an accumulation internally. Next up, I want to talk about how, as a naturopath, we would approach high histamine. What would we do from a naturopathic perspective? The first thing we try to do with every situation or every condition is work out what are the root causes? Because if we can remove the root causes, that means we're halfway there. And we acknowledge that perhaps it's not just the root cause of eating too much, but also everyone's different. We look at constitution type. We look at how well you might be metabolizing everything, food, chemicals, hormones. We look at your hormone profile. We look at your age. Is age going to play a role? How long have you been eating and living in a certain way? And what sort of impact would that have on your ability to detoxify and purify from histamine? And then, of course, we look at all the other things that differentiate one person from the next, because naturopathy is really an individualized and person-specific type of medicine. So in looking at what the root cause of the histamine buildup might be, we could consider there are a couple of different pathways in the body that we know about where histamine is meant to be metabolized but may not be properly metabolized and broken down. So, one of these is called the DAO, which is the diamine oxidase pathway. The other one is called the HNMT pathway, the histamine and methyltransferase pathway. Okay, I don't need to go into a huge amount of detail about these. Maybe it's a bit boring. The one that you want to know more about is DAO. So I'm going to focus on this one. The DAO pathway is the one that's gaining a lot of traction, particularly with naturopaths, because we've got great medicines to help this pathway. So if your issue is the DAO pathway, just know there are things you can do, there are supplements you can take that will really assist you greatly. I get fantastic responses with these. So the DAO pathway is essentially an enzyme pathway. A lot of these metabolic pathways in the body they rely on enzymes and vitamins and cofactors, things that keep the metabolic reactions going. So these enzymes are the ones that break the histamine down. DAO stands for diamine oxidase enzymes. So they're breaking the histamine down, and they work on the histamine that's found just outside your cells, though this would be the key difference between this particular pathway and the other one, the HNMT. So DAO enzymes are particularly fond of histamine. It's not their only role in terms of breaking down chemicals, but they really like to target histamine and break it down. And that's good for us because we need enough DAO enzyme activity to make sure that histamine is getting degraded and it's not building up in our bodies. So it's possible that you might actually have a deficiency of these enzymes, or they're not active enough. And so this is leading to the situation where you're not removing your histamine effectively. The supplements that we're using in clinic with these, they assist with the DAO enzyme activity and the breakdown of histamine. Beyond this, what you would want to do is get yourself onto a low inflammation, so anti-inflammatory, and a low histamine diet. I often find when I look at these two diets and compare them, they're so similar. So if you're on a low histamine diet, relax and enjoy, because it's probably the same as being put onto an anti-inflammatory diet. And if you do both at the same time, well, you get the best of both worlds. You get a really improved removal and degradation of histamine and less histamine coming into your body. So it's a win-win. So the low histamine diet that you might like to do your own reading about, I've got a PDF downloadable that you can access on my website for this. So you're very welcome to just jump onto my website at herbalwell.com.au. Herbalwell is spelled H-E-R-B for herb, A-L-W-E-L-L. And it's on my homepage. Have a look at that, because if you scroll through and you get the sense of what a low histamine diet looks like, it might just give you an idea of what to start shopping for. And, it's a great protocol. Basically, if you want to eat low histamine, the guideline is to eat or only eat foods that have less than 5 milligrams per kilo of histamine in them. So if you look up foods and their histamine content, you're looking for anything that's below 5 milligrams per kilo of histamine in that food. So that's kind of a way you could do it if you were wanting to just be ultra controlling on the amount of histamine coming in. But remember, if you go to that low histamine diet or anti-inflammatory diet and you follow that type of approach, then you're probably going to be achieving this anyway. So I'm taking information here also from a new book that's come out by Lee Holmes. I'll put the link below. It's actually written for chronic viral infections, but the protocol is very similar to what we would do with histamine issues, because chronic viral infections, for example, long COVID, they follow that same trajectory with the high histamine or histamine reactivity. And anyone who's on, or who suffers from those sorts of conditions will benefit from a low histamine diet. So I've taken some information from Lee's book here. And if you check out somewhere around the middle of the book, about page 164, you'll actually find some information from my own protocols for long COVID. So I, of course, am delighted to be included in this book, and I want to share with you some of the information from it as well, from Lee's expertise on the subject. And there's a big emphasis on low histamine in this book, big emphasis on anti-inflammatory. Here are some of the foods that happen to be very low in histamine and possibly even have an antihistamine effect naturally. So you've got your rocket salad, amazing. Apples and apricots, if you're thinking about fruits, blueberries, blackberries, any type of berries. For veggies, asparagus and beetroot are excellent. And broccoli. If you're thinking about nuts, Brazil nuts. So with all of these foods, when it comes to metabolizing and breaking down, things in our bodies, these sorts of foods will assist us to do that. So they're good metabolic support foods. Some of the other foods that can be really good for low histamine, anti-inflammatory, are carrots and cauliflowers, cumin as well, if you like cooking with spices. Celery is fantastic. Coconut milk is good. Corn and fennel, and also dragon fruit, which is one of my favorite fruits to put into smoothies. Whenever I make an anti-inflammatory smoothie, it's got mango, dragon fruit, coconut yogurt, coconut water, and a handful of rocket, and then all of the powders that I take. Vitamin C is fantastic for histamine issues, and I put magnesium in there, I put collagen in there. So definitely recommend dragon fruit. Then we've got flax seeds, ginger, goat's milk is also really good. Hemp seeds are fantastic. Kale is great. And if you need more fruit ideas, try grapes. So all these foods are really, really good. Try to avoid anything that's been packaged for a long time. And for example, canned foods tend to be a very high source of histamine because of the time that the food's been sitting inside the cans or preserved. So this means that if you're really into preserved foods and fermented foods, they're probably not great when it comes to having a high histamine intake in your diet, or if you're having histamine symptoms. And then we have mango, cooking spices, caraway, cardamom. Always good to cook with basil, which, I love cooking spices like cumin, which I mentioned before, but never forget rosemary, basil, marjoram, oregano. All of those classic cottage herbs are really fantastic. So some great things to cook with at breakfast too is oats. If you like breakfast oats, they're really good, very calming, particularly for conditions like eczema. They're really calming. And if you like peppermint tea, that's a really nice tea to have to reduce that histamine reactivity. Pumpkin seeds are great. I hope, some of these foods are resonating and you're thinking, oh yeah, I'm already eating all of these foods. Sweet corn, turkey, zucchini, radish, these are all fantastic. Some of my favorite herbs also for being low histamine are the ones that you will totally love cooking with. So I mentioned the cottage herbs, rosemary, don't forget sage, and basil and parsley. Try to cook with them more often, maybe even make iced teas with them in summer. They're really beautiful in an iced tea, very versatile. You can use them in casseroles and stews and soups. And my favorite supplements, I did mention vitamin C before. My favorite supplement for reducing the impact of histamine is quercetin, rutin, hesperidin. These are all flavonoids and polyphenols, and they're just fantastic supplements for providing an anti-inflammatory effect and an antioxidant effect. You may or may not have heard of the kakadu plum, hugely antioxidant. So one of our natives, really, really fantastic to use. Kiwi fruits, wonderful antioxidant. Strawberries and blueberries also. The B group of vitamins is very important. They're actually involved in a lot of metabolic reactions in the body, including those involved in the breakdown of histamine, in particular B6. But be aware that we've had some issues coming up with B6 toxicity. So just be aware of taking lots of different supplements that contain B6 because you can get a buildup of this one. And by the way, if you're a woman who happens to experience breast symptoms like tenderness or swelling or breast pain before a period, you might actually have a deficiency of B6. But check it out, make sure that you need it, and then supplement if you need it. Avoid over-supplementing with vitamin B6. So it's possible that if you do have a deficiency of B6, by the way, that it could be contributing to some of your histamine symptoms. So if you get those breast symptoms before each menstrual cycle, it's definitely worth checking out. Vitamin C is essential for the anti-inflammatory effect, and the oranges, kiwis, kakadu plums, strawberries, they're all fruits that are really high in vitamin C. There are also some wildcraft herbs that you can get, like or find growing around you, like chickweed. Chickweed is really high in vitamin C. Sow thistle, Sonchus oleracea, very high in vitamin C. And if you wanted to focus on those enzymes, the DAO enzymes, you can boost their levels by having foods which are rich in omega fatty acids. So oily fish, for example. There are some issues around eating a lot of fish these days, but if you would eat maybe wild caught salmon, that might help you. I'm not an expert on the levels of heavy metals and so on in fish, but I would just say it's probably not something you have every day, but it is a helpful food when it comes to increasing that DAO activity. Another way you can get that increase in DAO activity from these omegas is eating avocados and walnuts. So you can do it with plant foods as well. It's also important that you make sure that you get enough zinc, enough iron, enough magnesium in your diet. And you may need to supplement. These days, I don't believe that our soils have everything we need. We have been through a period of time where we've definitely extracted a lot from our soils and we haven't necessarily replenished them, nourished them, given them good probiotics and good minerals. So we're pretty deficient in our diets. If you're just trying to eat naturally, you probably at some stage will need some sort of supplementation. By the way, if it's iron, I do have another couple podcast episodes on iron. I talk about foods that are rich in iron. I think I even talk about the blood type, the blood diet approach. And I've got information on magnesium-rich foods on the blog, here in the podcast. So please listen to my other episodes and feel free to give me a great review. I love great reviews. And follow, subscribe. I would really love that. So that outlines hopefully enough about histamine. But the first thing I do is get yourself onto a low histamine diet. Well, I think I'll wrap up here for now. And, if you do happen to be suffering from histamine issues, have a look at that book by Lee Holmes. I'll put the link below on the natural approach to treating these chronic viral infections, which is anti-inflammatory and low histamine. And have a look through the rest of the episodes. Careful with the canned foods, careful with the fermented foods. Jump onto my website and grab that low histamine anti-inflammatory diet approach. And I wish you all the very best in your healing journey. Thank you for listening today. Please do follow and subscribe. Give me a review. Put a comment in the chat if you're watching this on YouTube. I love to hear from you. And I love to engage with you. So thank you. Take care of yourself. And I'll see you soon in another episode of Well Woman. Thank you for listening to the Well Woman podcast. The information, opinions, and advice in this podcast is not intended to replace professional medical advice, and it's for general information and educational purposes only. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast may not always be those of the host. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you soon in another episode of Well Woman.